At the end of the 1800s, the United States was rapidly expanding west in a push to make land for homesteading available to white citizens and, to a lesser degree, African American citizens recently freed from slavery. The seemingly unstoppable growth posed a problem harder and harder to ignore. What was to be done with the Native Americans? Our relations with the Indians located within our border impose upon us responsibilities we cannot escape. Every effort should be made to lead them through the paths of civilization and education to self-supporting and independent citizenship. In 1883, on a small patch of Cherokee land near the border of Kansas in what was then known as Indian Territory, crews began construction on the Chilocco Indian Agricultural School. The first federally run school for natives in Indian Territory, Chilocco would be charged with remaking generations of Native Americans in the image of the white man. The complicated legacy of the school would forever change the generations that passed beneath Chilocco's gates for the next 100 years. On January 15, 1884, 150 Native students entered Chilocco Indian Agricultural School's inaugural class. The imposing limestone facility would become the leading institution for Native agricultural studies in the region. The agricultural aspect of Chilocco was especially important because the vast majority of Americans still lived on farms. Farming was seen as the key to a civilized lifestyle, a tool for amplifying the assimilation of Native Americans.
When students arrived at Chilocco in the early days, often by wagon, so the first superintendent would go out to Cheyenne, Kiowa, Arapahoe. They would bring students back. Students were divested of their what were called home clothes. They were issued, government-issued GI clothing and uniforms, often numbered. Scrubbed down, usually with kerosene. The idea was to kill lice. They'd be fine combed with kerosene. Haircuts, often in a not very, shall we say, nurturing environment or way.
Sitting on over 8,000 acres of rich farmland, the original Chilocco building stood as a physical testament to the ideals the government wished to imbue in Native students. Chilocco was modeled after the Carlisle Indian School, established just 5 years earlier in Pennsylvania. Built out of a former prison barracks, the school had been founded by Richard Henry Pratt, a captain in the United States Army with a long history of fighting in the Indian Wars. A great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one. In a sense, I agree with that sentiment, but only in this: that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man.
And so his idea at Carlisle was to provide that kind of opportunity for Native people to learn white society, to learn trades, to learn a profession.
Pratt's vision of a civilized red man echoed popular public sentiment surrounding the Indian problem. Short of the proposed solution of complete Native genocide, the United States government began to forge a series of assimilation policies aimed at bringing the Indian closer to the white way of life. The General Allotment Act, also known as the Dawes Act, enacted in 1887, was such a policy. Under Dawes, communally held tribal lands were seized for redistribution as individually owned land parcels. To proponents of the act, individual land ownership was viewed as an effective means to breaking up tribal communities. The introduction of individualistic values into tribal groups was seen as key to bringing civilization to the natives. Schools like Chilocco deliberately fit into this assimilation plan. Located far from the communities most of the children were taken from, Chilocco was run on a militaristic model. The students were organized in military companies and would march in double file from place to place, their daily routine organized by 22 bugle calls. Half a day in the classroom, half a day on work detail, often very repetitive elementary labor. Much of the day-to-day maintenance of the school was attended to by the children, and work on the farm was designed to train the natives to take care of their allotments. Girls were trained to cook, clean, and mend clothing.
Congressional appropriations were never sufficient to cover costs, so that student labor was absolutely essential to both building the schools and then maintaining them, keeping them running, feeding the student body. Even when Chilocco was a high school in the 30s, that might have been the equivalent of 6th, 7th, possibly 8th grade education in the public schools at that time. Well, what we have to remember about the schools is that there was a particular federal agenda, erase and replace Indianness, but the school was populated by human beings. I mean, these Indian kids, young people, they weren't all, young children, young adults up to early 20s, so anywhere from 5 years old to 23, who were smart, tough in many cases, resilient, intelligent, determined to be individual people. Certainly they went through many traumas and great diversity of experience.
One distinct aspect of Chilocco was its diverse tribal makeup. Though the school was established inside Indian territory, enrollment during the early years consisted primarily of students entering from neighboring Oklahoma territory. It wasn't until 1910 that students hailing from the 5 so-called civilized tribes were allowed to attend. As time went on, the student body came to represent over 40 separate Native nations.
Some were heritage language speakers with limited or no English. Others came to Chilocco as English as a first language speakers. Some came to Chilocco by the 1920s from a second or third generation enrollment in boarding schools. Some came in as second or third generation Baptists or Catholics. Others came from native ceremonial religious traditions.
Much of the students' day-to-day lives were organized around tribal groupings based in part upon kinship, shared language and tribal affiliation, and/or notions of mixed or full-blood identity.
Those were important categories to Chilocco students, and that sorted the way people got along or didn't get along. Many alums talk about Chilocco as, this very interesting ground where people met folks native people they wouldn't have otherwise met, enduring friendships, some enduring hostilities, a lot of marriages across tribal lines there.
The grounds of the school contained a cemetery. Families of students who passed away while at Chilocco would oftentimes receive a form letter with news that their child had died. The school communicated news of the deaths to the Bureau of Indian Affairs as well. Sir, I have the honor to report the death this morning of Marian Cadman, a Navajo girl aged 12 years who has been a pupil of the Chilocco School. The cause of her death was quick consumption. Everything was done for her that skill, science, and sympathy could do. The corpse was buried in the Chilocco Cemetery as she had no home. Very respectfully, S.M. McCowan, Superintendent. While classes were conducted within a traditional academic year, students would often stay year-round on the property. Students often participated in the outing system, a brainchild of Richard H. Pratt. This system placed students with upstanding white families during the summer months. It was believed that accepting Native children into white Christian homes would show them how to live a civilized life. Over time, however, this system became little more than an opportunity for low-cost child labor. Some white families took advantage of the young women in their employ, assigning them additional chores and offering them little in way of exposure to the larger communities in which they were placed. Instances of abuse also occurred within the program. And while outings provided a change of environment, rarely did they provide relief from the restrictive and often punitive school nature.
Chilocco was a physically tough environment. There was incarceration in what they called the guardhouse, bread and water rations. There was disciplinary techniques like making somebody stand at attention for hours, in formation. Girls would talk about sometimes somebody would faint.
Despite the tough military environment, there was social life for the students. The school had athletics, a band, and Saturday dances. Sundays, church attendance was required.
Some students who had not been raised in those Christian traditions were quite resistant to that, my dad among them. There were underground practices of Native religious traditions at Chilocco. They had students had a very elaborate communication system, passing notes, a highly developed slang, kind of their own little language, ways and means to subvert school authority.
Many students went years at Chilocco without seeing home. Some students resisted the boarding school environment by running away.
Well, I think we can all imagine how difficult it was for families, for parents and loved ones to see their children, their grandchildren, their nieces and their nephews taken away from them for extended periods of time. Some parents resisted. Other parents saw schools like Chilocco as at least some kind of opportunity for an education that might help their children in the world. And so they were very reluctant, as parents would be, to not have their children with them, but they balanced that against what they saw as the potential benefits.
In 1928, a harsh report referred to as the Merriam Report, or the Problem of Indian Administration, criticized the government's Indian schools. It cited unsanitary living conditions, overcrowding, malnutrition, rigid discipline, and poor education. Several student and faculty accounts from the early days confirm the report's findings. The Merriam Report would provide the foundation for much-needed reform in Indian education, and it would usher in the next chapter of Chilocco's history, which many refer to as the Golden Years.